Today I am in the mood for a biplane. And while I was considering the Avia B534, which is just a great looking aircraft, I think instead we shall look at an aeroplane which some have dubbed the best looking biplane ever built. The Fairey Fantôme, also known as the Féroce. Yes, before the F4 Phantom there was the Fantôme. Actually, thinking about it, before the F4 Phantom, there was the FH Phantom, which also counts as another forgotten aircraft that I will have to get around to one day, but I digress. In 1934, the Belgian Air Force launched a competition to find themselves a new fighter. At the time, their principal offensive aircraft were the Firefly fighter and the Fox light bomber, both of which were produced by Aviation Fairey, a subsidiary of the British Fairey Aviation Company, which had created both aircraft. With production facilities in Belgium and good relations with the Belgian Air Force, Fairey decided to have a crack at meeting their new requirement. This wanted the new fighter to have a minimum top speed of 400 kilometers per hour, which is around 250 miles per hour, at 5,000 meters, 16,400 feet, an altitude it had to be able to attain in 6 minutes. For armament, the requirement listed two possibilities, one with 4 rifle caliber machine guns, the second with 2 machine guns, and a 20mm cannon. Fairey set about producing a new aircraft to meet the specification, headed up by their lead designer, Marcel Lobel, who was himself Belgian, and the prototype first flew on the 6th of June 1935. The Fantôme was undeniably an attractive aircraft. An unequal span biplane with minimal struts and bracing, the aircraft utilised a metal framework structure which is often listed in sources as being skinned in fabric. But to my eyes, and I'm pretty sure on this, looking at the pictures of the Fantôme, it appears it was metal panelled as far back as the rear of the cockpit, with fabric used to skin the rear fuselage and the wings, a fairly typical arrangement for aircraft of the day. For the engine, Fairey selected the French Hispano-Suiza 12Y CRS liquid cooled V12. This is generally listed in regards to the Fantôme as having a rated output of 925 horsepower, which would have been pretty remarkable in the day. A bit too remarkable, in fact, as I'm pretty sure that engine didn't produce that sort of horsepower until the late 1930s with improved superchargers. However, I can't pretend to be an expert on French interwar aircraft engines, so if anyone knows for sure, please let us all know in the comments. Regardless, the 12Y was an excellent engine of the time and allowed for the fitting of the specified 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It also gave the Fantôme a top listed speed of 270 miles per hour and the ability to climb to 13,000 feet in 5 minutes 40 seconds. Again, I am dubious about that and suspect the aircraft was stripped to absolute bare bones to achieve that speed, which admittedly isn't unusual with the top speed statistics given by manufacturers. In fact, it's pretty much the standard. But the aircraft's practical top speed was considerably less, as I shall get to. After performing several demonstrations for the public, which apparently were quite impressive, the Fantôme was delivered to the Belgians for them to begin their assessments. And tragically, it crashed on the 17th of July, killing the pilot. Despite this, all was not lost, as Fairey had actually produced enough components to build another 3 aircraft, predominantly to trial the different armament layouts of 4 machine guns. These were shipped to Aviation Fairey in Belgium for assembly so that the aircraft could continue assessment. Perhaps to deflect bad publicity after the loss of the Fantôme, Fairey's rebranded the aircraft as the Féroce, and in early 1936 the 3 new aircraft were delivered to the Belgian Air Force so that they could continue their testing. Unfortunately, in that brief window, the boat had kind of sailed. Here's the thing about the Fantôme. There is more to it than just its good looks. The Fantôme is a perfect example of how fast military aviation was progressing in the 1930s. In 1934, when the aircraft was being designed, it would have been a pretty respectable fighter, though I am sure it wouldn't have met the Belgians' full requirements in service configurations. However, even taking this into account, it still would have been comparable to other fighters of the time. But by 1936, when it really started to be available for proper assessment, it was definitely second rate, arguably obsolescent. By that point, aircraft like the Hawker Hurricane, the Curtiss Model 75, and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were well into development and on the point of entering service. These very much showed the way, and the Fantôme was definitely a product of an older era when compared against them, all in the space of a couple of years. That assessment is pretty much borne out by what happened to the three aircraft. With the Belgians no longer interested, eventually settling on the Hawker Hurricane and also exploring their own indigenous Renard designs, Fairey cast around to see if anyone else might want their new fighter. And the first buyer they found was the Soviet Union. In late 1936, two of the Fantômes, or I guess Féroce as they now were, arrived with their new owners, who began their assessments in 1937. The aircraft were one of each armament fit, and notably, whichever setup was flown, the aircraft's actual speed was 230 miles per hour. Soviet pilots did apparently like the excellent visibility that the Fantôme had, and their engineers were impressed with the quality of the workmanship and the layout of features, but they both recognised that the Fantôme was obsolete. In fly-offs against two aircraft then entering service with the Soviet Air Force, the Polikarpov I-16 fighter and the Ilyushin DB-3 bomber, the Soviets found that the Fantôme was completely outclassed. Indeed, they found that unless the aircraft could initiate an intercept on either of these types from the most favourable of circumstances, both the I-16 and the DB-3 could just open their throttles and outpace the biplane. Naturally, the Soviets concluded that the Fantôme was obsolete for them, and after about 60 flights or so, they ended their assessments. What happened to these two aircraft is unknown, and there are some sources that state the Soviets would supply them as military aid to the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War that was raging at the time. However, others state categorically that there is no evidence of this occurring. Honestly, there is the possibility that the Soviets sent them to Spain, but the truth of this will probably never be known for sure, and so the mystery of what happened to the Soviet Fantômes will likely never be resolved. The final aircraft was returned to Britain in 1937, where it too underwent testing. But just like the Soviets, the British had no interest in such an obviously outdated aircraft, and it was transferred to the Air Gunnery School in 1940 and ultimately struck off lists in 1943, assumably going for scrap soon thereafter. And that concludes the story of the Fairey Fantôme, a beautiful looking aircraft that was, I suppose somewhat fittingly, pretty much the end of the line for the biplane.